Don't let him walk in there. The voice was small, but it cut through the marble lobby so cleanly that even the echo seemed to stop and listen. Richard Whitmore's polished shoe froze half a step from the private elevator. Around him, the morning moved in expensive rhythms. The click of Italian heels, the hush of tailored wool, the low murmur of assistants carrying tablets and coffee like offerings to power. But now all of it stalled beneath the white glare of the executive floor. He turned slowly, irritation already sharpening his jaw. The child standing in his path looked no older than 9. She was thin, dark-skinned, and still in the faded navy cardigan of an elementary school uniform, the cuffs slightly frayed, her backpack hanging from one shoulder as if she had set it down and changed her mind at the last second. One sneaker lace was untied. In a room built to make ordinary people feel small, she somehow did not. Security glanced toward Richard, waiting for the smallest nod. He gave the girl barely a second. "Whose kid is this?" he asked, not loudly, but with the kind of cold control that usually made entire departments fall silent. Nobody answered fast enough. A young assistant near the reception desk looked down at her screen. Another pretended to adjust an earpiece. The girl kept her eyes on him. They were steady, unusually steady for a child, and that bothered him more than if she had cried or trembled or apologized. "Sir," she said, her voice low, almost careful, "if you go into that board meeting first, they're going to make you sign the wrong file." A ripple passed through the lobby. Not noise exactly. More like disbelief changing shape in real time. One of the men from investor relations let out a dry little laugh and stopped when nobody joined him. Richard's expression did not change, but something behind it tightened. He had spent 30 years building Whitmore Capital into the kind of company people either admired or feared, depending on how close they stood to it. Men twice this child's age rehearsed before speaking to him. Grown executives stumbled over numbers when he looked at them too long. And now a black girl in discount sneakers was blocking his elevator on the morning of the most important board vote of the quarter. "Move her," said a woman in a beige skirt suit, already stepping forward with the stiff smile reserved for problems beneath notice. "Sweetheart, you can't be up here." The girl didn't move. "I'm serious," she said, still looking only at Richard. "You're not supposed to walk in first. That's how they pin it on you." The woman reached for her shoulder. The child took one step back, not frightened, just refusing. On the edge of the lobby, near the frosted glass wall where the light came in cold and blue from 47th Street, a cleaning cart stood parked beside a service corridor. A spray bottle caught the overhead lights like a blade. Beside it stood a black woman in gray housekeeping gloves, breathless, eyes wide with dread. "Naomi," she whispered. "Baby, no." The name landed first, then the meaning. Richard's gaze flicked from the girl to the woman and back again. Mother and daughter. That explained the backpack, the school cardigan, the way the child had reached the executive floor through the service hall instead of the front bank of elevators. The woman rushed forward, pulling off one glove with her teeth, shame and panic rising in her face all at once. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm so sorry, sir. She's my daughter. The school let out early, and I had nobody to watch her, and I told her to stay in the break room. I am so sorry." Richard barely heard her. His attention was still fixed on the girl. "Naomi." She clutched a bent little notebook against her chest hard enough to wrinkle the cover. There was pencil graphite on the side of her hand. A child's hand. A child who should have been sitting in a cafeteria somewhere with a carton of milk and a spelling worksheet, not standing on the 32nd floor of a Manhattan investment firm interrupting a board meeting that could move markets before noon. "You have 5 seconds, he said. "Then I step into that elevator, and this interruption becomes your mother's problem, not mine." The mother flinched as if the words had weight. Naomi heard it too. Richard saw that in the way her fingers tightened around the notebook, but her chin stayed level. When she spoke again, the room seemed to lean toward her. "My daddy used to say honest men get trapped when people rush them." Richard stopped breathing for one strange, suspended second. The fluorescent sheen of the lobby, the muted hiss of the air vents, the distant ring of a phone from somewhere behind reception, all of it thinned into something far away. That sentence, not just the meaning, the exact shape of it, the cadence, the stillness after the word rushed. Margaret had said that to him once on a rainy Tuesday night 12 years ago while standing barefoot in their kitchen, one hand around a mug of tea, watching him tear through merger documents at 10:43 p.m. He had smiled then and waved her off. Honest men get trapped when people rush them. Richard, slow down. Nobody in this building knew that. Nobody outside his house had ever heard it. Yet here it was, spoken back to him by a 9-year-old girl in a faded cardigan under the hard white lights of his executive floor. He looked at her fully now, and for the first time all morning, he did not see an interruption. He saw a warning. Richard Whitmore did not move. For a man whose entire life had been built on movement, on decisions made fast and enforced faster, the stillness felt unnatural, almost offensive. Yet it held him there all the same. Naomi stood beneath the pale wash of lobby light with that same notebook pressed to her chest, her shoulders small inside a cardigan that had seen too many wash cycles, her face calm in a way that did not belong to most children. Around them, the executive floor had shifted into a different kind of silence now, one edged with caution. No one knew whether to look at Richard, at the little girl, or at Angela Carter, who stood half a step behind her daughter with one bare hand and one gloved hand, breathing too fast and trying not to show it. Richard's assistant, Evelyn Price, recovered first. She stepped forward, tablet still in hand, all sleek posture and practiced control. "Sir, the board is waiting," she said softly. "We are already 3 minutes behind." Richard did not answer. His eyes remained on Naomi. "Why did you say that sentence?" he asked. The question was simple, but the air changed when he asked it. Naomi blinked once, as if she had expected many things this morning, but not that. "Because it is true," she said. "And because my daddy used to say it when people tried to make him hurry." Richard's jaw flexed. The answer should have eased something. It did not. Instead, it deepened the feeling crawling under his ribs. Similar words could happen. Shared wisdom existed. Coincidence was not a crime. But exact phrasing was different. Exact phrasing belonged to memory. It belonged to kitchens after midnight and voices softened by trust. He finally looked at Angela. "How long has she been up here?" Angela swallowed. "Not long, sir. I was finishing the glass offices near the West Hall. She was supposed to stay in the staff break room on 29. I only turned my back for a few minutes." Shame warmed her face even as she tried to keep her voice steady. Richard knew the expression well. He had seen versions of it on employees called into compliance reviews, on junior associates defending mistakes they had not meant to make, on men and women who understood that one wrong inconvenience could cost them more than pride. He should have dismissed them both. He should have stepped into the elevator, entered the boardroom, and let operations deal with the breach. That was the efficient choice. Instead, he said, "What wrong file?" Naomi's fingers loosened slightly on the notebook, as if the question itself gave her permission to breathe. "I did not see the whole thing," she said. "Just some pages. By the printers near the big conference hall. 2 men were talking, and one of them said if you walked in first, legal would hand you version B, and the board would follow your signature." A faint stir ran through the people standing near reception. Evelyn's expression sharpened. Daniel Reeves, Whitmore Capital's general counsel, had just stepped out from the side corridor with a black binder tucked under one arm. He slowed when he sensed the tension, then stopped completely when he heard the last part. "Version B," he repeated. Naomi nodded and looked at him without fear. "Yes, sir. That is what he said. He also said you would not read every page if they kept everybody waiting." Daniel's face did not change much, but it changed enough. Richard caught it instantly. A lawyer at that level did not waste surprise on nonsense. "What printers?" Daniel asked. "The silver ones by the long window where the floor smells like coffee all the time," Naomi said. There was a paper on the tray with a blue tab and a page that did not match the others. The numbers looked too close together. Richard turned to Evelyn. "Get the boardroom packet." She hesitated only a beat. "Sir, the final packet was already delivered upstairs." "Then bring it back down." His voice stayed quiet, which only made the command land harder. Evelyn moved immediately, heels sharp against stone as she crossed toward the private elevator and vanished inside with one of the security men. The remaining staff shifted where they stood. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody whispered now. Naomi's words had pushed the morning off script, and people in buildings like this were always most frightened when the script failed. Richard looked again at the little girl. "You were telling me you noticed page spacing." She shrugged one shoulder, almost embarrassed. "My father used to let me help when he checked papers at home. He said bad pages tell on themselves if you slowed down enough." Angela closed her eyes briefly, Like the memory hurt and helped at the same time. Her father was an accountant, she said quietly. Forensic work, before he got sick. Richard said nothing. The phrase lodged deeper. Honest men get trapped when people rush them. Slow down. Bad pages tell on themselves. It all sounded like a house where numbers mattered because truth mattered first. He glanced at Naomi's notebook. What is in there? Math homework, she said. And what the man said. That made him look at her sharply. You wrote it down? Naomi nodded and opened the bent cover. The pages inside were filled with careful pencil print, neat block letters, and short equations in the margins. Near the back, she had written a sentence phonetically, the way a child records sound before fully understanding meaning. Legal walks him in. Version B, board follows signature. Another line beneath it read, blame shifts after approval. Richard felt the morning tilt. Not dramatically, just enough for instinct to take over where certainty ended. At the far end of the lobby, the elevator chimed. Evelyn stepped out carrying a leather portfolio, Daniel already moving to meet her. The folder opened on the reception counter beneath the bright overhead lights. Pages turned. Tabs lifted. A beat passed, then another. Daniel stopped on one sheet and went still. When he raised his eyes to Richard, the color had drained from his face. Sir, he said carefully. This indemnity page was replaced. No one in the lobby breathed for a second. Daniel slid the paper free with 2 fingers as if it were evidence. This language transfers downstream liability to Whitmore Capital after board execution. This is not the approved draft. Richard stared at the page, but it was not the words that hit him first. It was the child standing 6 feet away from him with graphite on her hand and a backpack slipping off one shoulder, the only person in the building who had chosen not to stay quiet. The effect of Daniel Reeves's words did not arrive all at once. It moved through the lobby in layers, first through the legal team, then through the assistants, then through the men who had spent years pretending nothing could surprise them inside Whitmore Capital. Replaced. Not revised. Not updated. Replaced. The distinction settled over the polished stone and glass like a drop in temperature. Richard Whitmore did not reach for the page immediately. He kept his eyes on Daniel for one long second, then another, as if giving the man one final chance to soften what he had just said. Daniel did not. He simply turned the document slightly on the reception counter so the language sat in full view beneath the white overhead lights. The page looked ordinary at first glance. Cream stock. Black serif type. A blue tab at the top corner. But now that Richard was looking for the flaw, he saw it. The spacing on the lower half sat tighter than the approved formatting used by his legal department. The margin on the left was narrower by a fraction. A fraction most people would miss. A fraction a child had not. How long has this been in the packet? Richard asked. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. I do not know yet. Then find out. Richard's voice stayed level, but the room heard the iron in it. Daniel nodded once and began flipping through the full set with greater speed, checking tab colors, footer marks, document coding. Evelyn stood beside him, now pale beneath her makeup, tapping her screen for the digital record of the last authorized draft. Across the lobby, a few executives from the board had started to appear near the corridor leading from the conference hall, drawn by delay and instinct, the way people always drifted toward power when they sensed a changing direction. Angela Carter took a small step toward Naomi as though to place herself between her daughter and whatever came next. The motion was quiet, almost invisible, but Richard noticed it. He noticed the way Angela's shoulders were still tense from apology, the way one latex glove remained half-peeled from her wrist, the way she kept glancing toward Naomi with fear and pride tangled together so tightly they looked like the same thing. He noticed Naomi too, standing in the middle of a world built to ignore people like her, still holding that bent notebook, still not fidgeting. Most children, after causing a disruption like this, would have looked around for rescue. Naomi did not. She watched the adults the way adults watch numbers when the numbers stopped behaving. Show me the approved version, Richard said. Evelyn turned her tablet toward him with both hands. The screen displayed the original indemnity clause, reviewed and time-stamped at 7:16 that morning. Daniel laid the physical page beside it. Side by side, the difference was no longer subtle. The altered page pushed exposure for post-approval losses back onto Whitmore Capital while shielding the outside party through a conditional carve-out disguised as compliance language. Clean. Elegant. Deadly. The kind of trap that relied on speed, authority, and the assumption that everyone important would be too important to slow down. Richard felt something bitter rise in his chest, not panic exactly, but the cold anger that came when intelligence was used without integrity. He had built his life among men who called that strategy. Margaret had called it rot. For a moment, he could almost hear her voice again, soft and unimpressed, moving through memory with the smell of black tea and rainwater on window glass. Slow down, Richard. Rot always hides in polished places first. His gaze shifted to Naomi before he could stop it. She was staring past him now, toward the far end of the lobby, where the hallway opened to the boardroom vestibule. Not blankly, not curiously, sharply, as if some piece inside her was trying to fit. Richard followed her line of sight. Near the tall frosted doors, a man in a charcoal suit had just emerged from the corridor connecting legal and executive operations. Mid-40s, silver cuff links, dark red tie, posture too controlled. One of the senior strategy officers. Thomas Bell. Richard knew him as the kind of man who smiled carefully and never sweated in meetings. Bell slowed when he saw the crowd gathered around reception. His expression held for a fraction too long before settling into something concerned and neutral. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Naomi's fingers tightened on the notebook again. Richard saw it. Daniel saw it too. Bell started toward them, but not quickly. Measured. Watching. Naomi took one small step closer to her mother, then looked up at Richard with that same calm that did not belong to 9-year-olds. "That is the voice," she said. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Bell stopped. The lobby seemed to contract around the sentence. Angela drew in a breath so fast it sounded painful. Evelyn lowered her tablet by an inch. Daniel went still, his hand resting on the swapped page. Richard did not turn right away. He let the silence stretch just long enough to feel Bell inside it. Then he faced him fully. For the first time that morning, Thomas Bell's perfect composure slipped. Only slightly. Only around the eyes, but enough. Richard saw it and knew. Not the whole shape of the betrayal yet. Not who else was involved or how many layers it ran beneath the board vote upstairs. But enough to understand that Naomi Carter had not merely stopped him from signing a bad page. She had pointed, with the unshaken certainty of a child who had no reason to lie, at a man standing inside his own house. Thomas Bell recovered faster than most guilty men did. That was the first thing Richard Whitmore noticed. Not panic. Not outrage. Recovery. Bell's shoulders eased by less than an inch, his mouth flattening into a polite line that could pass for confusion if someone wanted it to. Men survived in Manhattan towers by learning how to shape their faces before their thoughts gave them away. "I beg your pardon," Bell said, looking not at Naomi but at Richard, as though the child's voice did not merit direct response. The move was subtle. So was the contempt inside it. Naomi felt it anyway. Richard saw that too. She did not shrink, but something in her small posture sharpened, like a note held longer than expected. Around them, the executive floor had become all edges. The white light above reception reflected off. Stone, glass, and stainless steel, making every expression look clearer than people wanted. Daniel Reeves closed the portfolio with deliberate care. Evelyn Price lowered her tablet to her side. From the corridor near the boardroom vestibule, two directors had paused mid-conversation, their polished shoes angled toward the scene without pretending otherwise. The entire building seemed to understand at once that this was no longer a delay. It was a fracture. Richard turned fully toward Bell. "She says she heard your voice near the printers discussing an altered packet." Bell gave a soft exhale through his nose, a careful sound, not quite a laugh. "Richard, with respect, she is a child." There it was. Not a denial. A reduction. A way of lowering Naomi without touching her. Richard had heard the same tone in country clubs, donor dinners, conference calls, and private schools. He had used it himself, once upon a time, back when he still believed status improved perception instead of corrupting it. Bell shifted his gaze briefly toward Angela and then back, as if the whole explanation had already assembled itself in his mind. "I am sure she heard someone." Executive floors echo. Voices carry. We are minutes from a board vote. I would be careful about dismantling a morning over hallway confusion. Angela's face tightened. She knew what that meant. Hallway confusion. A neat phrase. Clean enough to sound reasonable. Sharp enough to leave a mark. Naomi held the notebook even tighter, graphite smudging the edge of her thumb. Richard noticed the detail for no reason he could explain except that the child had become the still point in a room full of motion. "What exactly did you hear?" he asked her. Naomi looked up at him, then past him again toward Belle, then back. "He said legal would walk you in with version B," she said. "He said if you signed first, everybody else would follow because nobody likes to be the one who slows down a room full of rich men." A few people nearby shifted where they stood. Belle's expression remained composed, but color had changed around the base of his neck. "This is absurd," he said a little faster now. "Richard," she could not possibly understand context. "She is repeating fragments." Naomi answered before Richard could. "You also said the blue tab would keep it from standing out." The room went silent in a new way after that. Even the air conditioning seemed louder. Daniel looked down at the swapped page on the counter, then at the blue tab fixed to the top corner. Evelyn's eyes moved from the document to Belle and stayed there. Angela lifted a trembling hand to her mouth. Belle took one measured step forward. "This is dangerous," he said. "Accusing a senior officer of document interference based on the memory of a 9-year-old child is not governance. It is theater." "Then it should be easy to clear up," Richard said. Belle stopped. Richard's voice had not risen, but the words landed hard enough that nobody mistook them for conversation. He stepped closer to the reception counter, laid one hand beside the altered packet, and looked at Daniel. "Pull printer logs from this floor. Last 90 minutes. Every device near the boardroom vestibule, legal corridor, and west window station." Daniel nodded at once. "Already on it. Freeze outgoing email on all versions of the acquisition packet until I say otherwise." "Done." Richard looked to Evelyn. "Security footage. I will get building access to release it now." Belle's smile came then, but only because he had to place something where control used to be. "Richard, this is extreme." Richard let the silence answer first. It had more power than volume. Then he said, "Extreme would have been letting me walk into a boardroom with a liability trap hidden in my own packet while one of my officers stood by and watched." Belle opened his mouth, then closed it. The directors by the hallway no longer looked curious. They looked cautious, which was worse. Caution spread faster than rumor in rooms where reputations fed careers. Naomi stood very still beside her mother, but now her eyes had drifted toward Belle's tie. Dark red, fine weave, a tiny diagonal pattern visible only up close. Richard had no idea why he followed her gaze until she spoke again. "He had that tie on," she said softly, and he tapped the printer tray 2 times with his fingers before he picked up the pages. Belle turned to her then, finally, and the look he gave her was brief, polished, and hollow all at once. He still did not shout. He still did not lose his temper. In some ways that made the moment colder. Naomi noticed it too, but she did not look away. Richard felt something shift inside him, deep and unwelcome. Not just anger. Recognition. How many times had a child like this been telling the truth in a room like this while adults searched for a cleaner lie because the truth came from the wrong mouth? Belle adjusted his cuff as if his hands needed something to do. "Richard, I have worked for this company for 11 years. And she has been here for 11 minutes, Richard said. "Yet one of you warned me before I signed." No one moved after that. The sentence hung in the bright corporate air with nowhere soft to land. Daniel's phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced down, and whatever he saw emptied the last of the neutrality from his face. He lifted his eyes slowly to Richard. "The printer logs just came through," he said. Version B was printed at 9:14 from Thomas Bell's executive credentials. The words landed harder than any raised voice could have. For a moment, Thomas Bell did not blink. The printer logs were not theory. They were not hallway memory or a child's careful notes in pencil. They were time-stamped, traceable, sterile in the way only machines could be, and somehow that made the betrayal feel colder. Daniel Reeves held the phone at his side now, but the damage had already been done. The screen's pale light had flashed across his face just long enough for everyone in the lobby to understand that this was no misunderstanding. This was evidence. Thomas Bell's executive credentials. 9:14 a.m. version B. Printed from the west window station, less than 20 feet from where Naomi had said she heard the conversation. Richard Whitmore looked at Bell and saw something he had not allowed himself to see in years. Not incompetence. Not ambition. Calculation without conscience. Bell had spent 11 years learning the architecture of Whitmore Capital, learning the rhythms of its people, the blind spots created by money and routine and hierarchy. And this morning, he had trusted those blind spots more than he had feared getting caught. What he had not accounted for was a 9-year-old girl with a notebook, a memory built on grief, and the habit of paying attention when adults assumed she would disappear into the background. Bell let out a slow breath and adjusted the cuff of his shirt as if the morning were still recoverable through posture alone. Executive credentials can be used by assistants, he said. Shared access happens all the time on a floor like this. Daniel's expression did not move. Not on secure print release. It requires direct badge authentication at the machine. Bell's eyes flicked toward Daniel, then toward the men near the boardroom hallway, calculating, searching for the one face in the room that might still lean his way. He found none. That was the thing about power. It looked loyal right up until it smelled weakness. Richard took one step closer. The marble beneath his shoes reflected a broken map of white light and dark wool. He had not raised his voice once that morning, and because of that, every word now sounded heavier. Who else is involved? Bell's jaw tightened. I am not answering that in a lobby in front of staff and a child. Naomi stood very still beside Angela, but at the word child something faint crossed her face. Not fear. Recognition. She had heard that tone before. Adults who wanted the truth smaller always reached for age first, then class, then race, until the person speaking no longer sounded worth hearing. Richard heard it too, and for reasons he could not have explained even to himself, that bothered him more than the altered packet. You will answer, he said, because the child you keep dismissing is the only reason you are still standing here with the chance to explain yourself. Bell said nothing. The silence around him grew denser, more expensive somehow, full of polished shoes and controlled breathing and the quiet panic of people revising their loyalties in real time. Evelyn's phone lit up with an incoming message. She scanned it quickly, then looked to Richard. Security has the footage from the West Station, she said. They are sending it now. Bell's composure cracked for the first time then, just at the edges. Tiny, but real. His hand flexed once at his side. Naomi saw it. Richard saw her seeing it. The child's eyes were not on Bell's face now, but on his fingers, on the movements adults made when the body betrayed the lie before the mouth did. Angela reached for Naomi's shoulder, more gently this time, and Naomi leaned into her mother by less than an inch. It was the first sign that she was still 9 years old under all that steadiness. Richard felt an unfamiliar pull in his chest when he noticed it. It was one thing to admire courage in theory. It was another to watch it standing in untied sneakers under corporate lighting, carrying more risk than it understood because truth had mattered more to it than comfort. Mr. Whitmore, Angela said quietly, her voice raw from holding too much in. She was only trying to help. If this causes trouble for her, for me, I just need you to know she did what I taught her to do. If something is wrong, you say something, even if people do not like where it comes from. Richard looked at her then, really looked at her, and the shame came not as a dramatic blow, but as a thin, cold line sliding through his thoughts. How many people in his building had passed Angela Carter in service hallways without ever seeing the discipline in her posture, the exhaustion in her hands, the dignity it took to raise a child in a city that charged too much for everything and still looked through you? How many times had he? Bell glanced toward the private elevator. Security noticed and shifted instantly, blocking the cleanest exit without laying a hand on him. The message was clear enough. You are staying. Another executive had stepped into view from the boardroom corridor now. Then another. Men who had come upstairs expecting a vote now stood beneath the glass walls watching a different kind of reckoning. Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time Evelyn's device chimed almost at once after his. Daniel opened the footage first. Richard watched his face. A flicker of confirmation passed through it. He turned the screen outward just enough for Richard to see. Grainy overhead video. The West Window Print Station. 9:14. Thomas Bell stepping up alone, badge out, packet in hand. A second figure entering the frame seconds later, but never fully visible. Only a sleeve, part of a shoulder, someone waiting just outside clear view near the hall bend. Bell printing. Bell tapping the tray twice with 2 fingers. Bell sliding out one page and replacing it with another from a dark folder. Bell looking over his shoulder before walking toward the boardroom vestibule. Naomi drew in a soft breath beside her mother. That is what he did, she whispered. Richard stared at the screen, but the image that Stayed with him was not Belle's hand over the paper. It was the partial figure near the edge of the frame. Someone else. Belle had not worked alone. The trap had a second shadow. Richard lifted his eyes from the phone to Belle's face. "You lied to my company," he said. Then his gaze shifted, just briefly, to the frozen edge of that security frame in his mind. "And you did not do it alone." Richard Whitmore had spent most of his adult life learning how people betrayed trust. Sometimes they did it loudly, through greed so obvious it almost insulted the room. More often they did it quietly, through timing, formatting, access, and the simple arrogance of believing no one beneath a certain salary would ever notice. What unsettled him now was not only that Thomas Bell had tampered with a board packet in his own building. It was that a 9-year-old girl had seen the shape of the lie faster than a floor full of executives trained to prevent exactly this. Bell stood beneath the recessed ceiling lights with his suit still perfect and his options narrowing by the second. There was a particular look men wore when they realized the room had turned against them before they had finished speaking. Bell wore it now, though he tried to smooth it into something cooler. "You are making assumptions from partial footage," he said. "A page swap does not prove motive. It proves document handling." Daniel Reeves almost looked offended. "It proves unauthorized alteration of a legal packet minutes before a board vote." Bell opened his mouth to answer, but Richard lifted one hand, and the motion cut across the lobby more effectively than any shout. Silence returned at once. Through the glass behind reception, the late morning sky over Midtown had turned the color of brushed steel. Sunlight filtered through high clouds and fell pale across the marble floor, making every shadow look precise. Naomi noticed that kind of thing. Richard could tell. Her eyes kept flicking toward reflections, movement, patterns, the small details adults often flattened into background. She was still holding the notebook against her chest, but less tightly now, as if the truth being believed had loosened something inside her. Angela stood close enough for their sleeves to touch. She had not said a word in the last minute. She looked as though speaking might break the fragile line between having helped and having gone too far. Richard understood that line better than she knew. In rooms like this, truth only counted once power agreed to hear it. "Pull the full corridor feed," Richard said. Evelyn nodded and stepped aside to make the call, speaking in a low, clipped tone into her headset. Daniel was already messaging compliance. Bell looked from one to the other, calculating again, then back to Richard. "Even if you believe I printed the page, you do not know what happened before that. You do not know who instructed what. You do not know whether this was internal revision or an emergency correction." Richard studied him. The man still wanted ambiguity because ambiguity was the only oxygen left in the room. "Then name the person," Richard said. Bell did not. Naomi's eyes narrowed the slightest bit, not in suspicion but in concentration, as if a memory she had not needed until now had just shifted into focus. She looked toward the boardroom corridor again, beyond Bell this time, toward the corner where the legal hall bent out of sight. "There was someone else," she said quietly. No one ignored her now. Bell did not move, but his stillness turned rigid. Richard faced Naomi fully. "What do you remember?" She thought before answering, not hesitating. "Sorting." Her father had taught her that, Richard realized. Not just numbers, but sequence. "I heard 2 sets of shoes," she said. Mr. Bell's shoes were louder. The other person walked softer. Not heels, not sneakers. Dress shoes, but smoother. "And I smelled coffee before they came around the corner. Strong coffee, like the kind from the machine near the legal offices, not the one in the staff room downstairs." Daniel and Evelyn exchanged a glance. Daniel said, "The legal suite has the only dark roast machine on this floor." Naomi nodded quickly, and the second person kept saying, "He will never look that low on the page if we move fast." Richard felt the words settle heavily into him. Not legal advice, not review language. Strategy built on impatience, on ego, on the belief that a man used to command would not stoop to inspect the bottom edge of a page. Bell gave a short, breathless laugh that sounded wrong in the room. "Richard, this is becoming absurd. We are now relying on coffee smells and children's guesses about shoes." "No," Richard said. "We are relying on a witness who paid attention while the adults in this building trusted rank more than detail." The sentence landed harder than he intended because it was aimed partly at himself. He knew that. Angela lowered her eyes for a second, and Richard understood why. People like Angela Carter live their lives in the radius of words like witness and detail without ever being granted the dignity attached to them. Naomi, though, kept looking at Bell. She was no longer intimidated by him. She was trying to solve him. He is missing something, she said. Richard frowned slightly. Who? The other person, Naomi said. On the video. I only saw part of the sleeve, but when they were by the printers, he had a cup with a gold lid. Not white. Gold. And there was writing on it. Maybe 2 letters. I think one was an R. Daniel's brows drew together. Executive lounge cups. Evelyn said at once as she ended her call. Those are custom from the 32nd floor coffee service. Gold lids only go to board members and senior officers. Bell's face changed then, just enough. Not with panic. With annoyance. As if Naomi's memory had become inconvenient in a way he had not expected from a child. That look told Richard more than Bell's denials ever could. The second person mattered. Perhaps more than Bell did. Security has the extended feed, Evelyn added. The blind corner camera from legal just uploaded. Daniel moved beside her to read over the screen. Richard did not crowd them. He stood where he was, feeling the strange geometry of the moment take shape around him. A board meeting delayed. A betrayal exposed. A child in a worn school cardigan quietly rebuilding the truth from sound, smell, and one partial glimpse of a cup lid. Margaret would have understood this immediately. Not the scandal. The deeper thing. The way decency and attention so often traveled together. The way people dismissed the observant when the observant came in the wrong package. Daniel's face lifted first. Then Evelyn's. Neither looked relieved. Sir, Daniel said slowly. The second person came from the board lounge, not legal. Bell closed his eyes for the briefest second. Richard saw it. So did Naomi. And when Bell opened them again, the room no longer belonged to him. Richard Whitmore had always believed betrayal announced itself if you listened long enough. A delayed answer. A hand too still. A sentence polished one time too many. But this was different. This betrayal had not announced itself through one of his senior officers, or through the legal department, or through the board members now gathering at the far end of the executive corridor in expensive silence. It had announced itself through a 9-year-old girl with pencil marks on her hand and a memory sharper than anyone in the room had expected her to have. Daniel Reeves held the phone just below chest height. The extended corridor footage paused on the frame that mattered. Thomas Bell stood beside the West Printer Station, shoulders angled toward the boardroom vestibule, while another figure moved in from the board lounge carrying a coffee cup with a gold lid. The face was partially obscured by the hallway angle, but the posture was enough to make several people in the lobby shift where they stood. The board lounge was not a public area. Access there meant rank. Access there meant invitation. Access there meant the second shadow, and this had not come from outside the company. It had come from the very room where influence dressed itself like governance. Richard looked at Bell, and for the first time that morning he saw the man's confidence not as strength, but as habit, the kind built over years of watching people protect the polished lie because the truth would cost too much. Bell said nothing. He no longer seemed eager to explain the footage away with references to misunderstanding or context. That silence told Richard almost as much as the video had. Beside Naomi, Angela Carter had gone completely still. Her daughter had stepped into a world of glass walls, private elevators, and cold voices, and somehow she had not been swallowed by it. Angela knew what that world usually did to people like them. It made them smaller first. Then it called to shrinking professionalism. Richard felt the shame of that in places he had long ago trained himself not to examine. Naomi, though, was no longer looking at Bell. She was staring at the paused image on Daniel's phone with the intense concentration of someone trying to lift one more truth out of a room that was almost done believing her. Can you make it bigger? She asked. Softly. Daniel glanced at Richard. Richard nodded once. Daniel expanded the frame. The image grew grainier, but the details shifted into visibility. Bell at the printer. The second figure half turned. The coffee cup. The sleeve of a dark navy jacket. A hand with a signet ring catching the fluorescent light for half a second. Naomi leaned forward, her backpack sliding a little on her shoulder. I saw that, she said. Richard followed her gaze. The ring. Naomi shook her head. No, sir. The way he holds the cup. He used 2 fingers under the lid because it was hot. He did that when he turned near the window, too. Her voice remained small. but now the room bent toward it without resistance. And he had a silver watch that flashed when he moved. Not square. Round. Thin. One of the board directors near the corridor exhaled quietly. Another lowered his eyes. Richard noticed both. In buildings like this, people never reacted to details unless the details had begun narrowing towards someone real. Evelyn Price looked up from her device. There are 6 men on the senior board with access to the executive lounge and custom coffee service this morning, she said. 3 wore dark navy. Only 2 were logged in on this floor before 9:15. Bell's jaw set harder. Richard, I strongly advise that you stop this before you damage the board with speculation. The board is already damaged, Richard said. The difference is that now it has witnesses. The word hung there. Witnesses. Not staff. Not help. Not someone's child. Witnesses. Angela's eyes lifted at that. Something fragile and startled moving through them before she lowered them again. Naomi remained fixed on the screen. Richard could almost see her mind sorting through sound, color, motion, and memory the way other children sorted marbles or flashcards. Grief had sharpened her. So had love. Somewhere in the middle of this towering, overlit floor filled with polished adults, Richard felt the unbearable clarity of that. A child had been taught to notice because her father believed truth lived in details. That lesson had walked into his building in worn sneakers and saved him from signing away the company's protection. Daniel's phone buzzed with another incoming file. He opened it and frowned. Security pulled badge movement from the board lounge entrance, he said. There were 2 exits within the 60-second window before Bell printed the packet. Thomas Bell, and he stopped. Richard did not like pauses from competent men. And who? Daniel looked up. Robert Langford. The name traveled through the lobby like a draft through an old house. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Robert Langford was not just another executive. He was vice chair of the board, a man whose voice could calm markets, shape headlines, and make younger officers speak more carefully when he entered a room. White-haired, steady, civic-minded in public, the kind of man quoted in business magazines beneath headlines about stewardship and principle. Richard felt something colder than anger settle into him then. Bell had not just helped alter a packet. He had done it with someone close enough to the center of the company to call the movement strategy instead of sabotage. Naomi looked up from the screen. That name sounds right, she said. I think Mr. Bell said Rob already cleared the room. Bell's face lost what little color remained in it. There were moments when a lie collapsed dramatically, all noise and denial and scrambling panic. This was not one of them. This was quieter, more devastating. The kind of collapse that happened when the last uncertain piece slid into place and everybody in the room understood it at the same time. Richard turned his head slowly toward the board corridor. At the far end, just beyond the frosted glass doors, Robert Langford had appeared. He had probably come down to control the story before it moved without him. He stood with one hand near his jacket button, silver hair immaculate, expression composed in the way only very practiced men could manage when they believed composure itself still counted as authority. The round face of a thin silver watch gleamed once at his wrist under the cold, overhead light. Naomi saw it. Richard felt her small intake of breath before he heard her voice. That is him, she whispered. And this time, nobody in the lobby looked away. Robert Langford did not rush when he entered the lobby. Men like him never did. He moved with the calm certainty of someone who had spent 3 decades teaching rooms to adjust themselves around his timing, not the other way around. His navy suit sat perfectly on his frame, his silver hair cut with the kind of precision money forgot to hide, and that thin round watch at his wrist caught the overhead light exactly once as he approached. It was enough. Naomi Carter saw it and went still in a deeper way than before, as if the last uncertain shape in her memory had finally come into focus. Beside her, Angela's breath hitched softly. Richard Whitmore heard it, but he did not look away from Langford. The vice chair's face held its usual expression of cultivated reason, the one that had reassured investors, journalists, and half the board through every hard quarter of the last 10 years. But Richard knew him too well not to notice the crack at the edges. It was in the pause before he spoke, in the way his eyes registered the crowd, then the open portfolio on reception, then Thomas Bell, then Naomi, in that exact order. Assessment first. Innocence second. Richard, Langford said, his voice low and even, almost warm. I was told there was some confusion delaying the vote. Confusion. Another clean word. Another polished cover laid over something rotten. Richard felt the lobby tighten around it. Bell kept his gaze down now, not submissive, not ashamed, just calculating whether silence still offered better odds than speech. Daniel Reeves stood with the altered packet in one hand and his phone in the other, ready for instruction. Evelyn Price had moved slightly to Richard's right, the posture of a woman who understood the next 5 minutes might reshape the company more than the board meeting ever would have. Naomi looked up at Langford and then down to his hand. The signet ring gleamed once as he adjusted the button of his jacket. Richard saw her see it. "That is the ring," she said quietly. No one missed the words. Langford's head turned toward her at last. For one brief second, the civility in his face thinned. He looked at her the way powerful men sometimes looked at truth when it came from a place they did not respect. Not outrage. Not fear. Annoyance. It vanished quickly, replaced by something patient and paternal. "I do not believe we have met," he said. Naomi did not answer him. She stayed close to her mother and held the notebook to her chest with both hands. Angela's fingers rested lightly on her daughter's shoulder now, not to silence her, but to remind her she was not alone. Richard noticed that too. He noticed everything now, or tried to. How many years had he let men like Langford teach him that the loudest confidence in the room deserved the first assumption of honesty? "You left the board lounge at 9:13, Richard said. Langford's eyes returned to him. "I walked the corridor, yes. That is hardly unusual. You met Bell near the West Printer." "If I did, it would not have meant misconduct." Richard let the silence stretch. Then he nodded toward Daniel. Daniel turned the phone so Langford could see the frame. Grainy footage. Bell at the printer. Langford entering from the board lounge with the gold-lidded cup in hand, sleeve visible, watch flashing. Not perfect, but enough. Langford studied it without outward reaction. "This proves proximity, not intent," he said. "In this building, Richard, proximity is not guilt." "No," Richard said, "but altered liability language is." The words landed between them like a locked door. Around the lobby, the board members who had drifted closer no longer looked merely concerned. They looked frightened. Not of scandal, of alignment. Everyone was measuring who had known, who had guessed, who had stayed conveniently incurious. Naomi's small voice entered the silence again. "You said, he will never look that low on the page if we move fast." Langford turned toward her fully then. Richard watched the movement with a coldness he had not felt in years. The child did not flinch, but he saw the effort it cost her to remain steady beneath that gaze. Langford smiled faintly. "That is quite a memory for someone your age." The condescension in it was so smooth, it almost passed as kindness. Almost. Naomi lifted her chin. "My father said people say the truth out loud when they think no one important is listening." Angela closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them again there was water in them she would not let fall. Richard felt something old and hard inside him shift. Langford's expression changed, just slightly, at the mention of a father. Not because he cared, Richard suspected, but because grief gave Naomi's steadiness a source he could not easily dismiss as childish imagination. Daniel's phone buzzed again. He checked it, then looked up sharply. "Sir," he said to Richard. Compliance pulled the internal message archive from Bell's work account. There was a deleted draft sent. At 8:58 to Robert Langford. Subject line, version be ready. It references timing your entrance to secure signature sequence before full review. Even Langford could not hide the stillness that followed. It was not panic. Men like him did not panic in public. But the room saw it anyway, the invisible collapse of options, the moment a narrative stopped belonging to its author. Richard looked from Langford to Naomi, to the notebook in her small hands, to Angela standing in her cleaning gloves on a floor that had never expected to owe her family anything. Then he looked back at the vice chair of his board and understood, with a clarity that felt almost cruel, that the most honest person in his building that morning had been the one everyone had first tried to move out of the way. The lobby no longer felt like part of Whitmore Capital. It felt like a courtroom without a judge, a place where every polished surface now reflected not authority, but exposure. Richard Whitmore stood in the middle of it with the altered packet on the reception counter, the vice chair of his board in front of him, and a 9-year-old black girl beside a cleaning cart proving herself more credible than men whose names opened doors across Manhattan. Robert Langford had not spoken since Daniel Reeves read the deleted message aloud. Version be ready, timing his entrance to secure signature sequence before full review. There were no soft interpretations left after that. No elegant words to slide over the truth and make it sound procedural. Still, Langford tried for composure. Men like him always did. He slipped one hand into his jacket pocket, a gesture meant to suggest calm, but Richard noticed the stiffness in it. So did Naomi. She was watching the adults the way she had all morning, not for their words anymore, but for the cracks around them. Angela stood close at her daughter's side, one gray glove still hanging loose from her wrist, her shoulders tired but lifted now by something fragile and fierce. Richard had spent years around expensive courage, the kind performed in earnings calls and magazine interviews. What Angela carried was different. It had no stage. It was the courage of a woman who had cleaned glass walls while raising a child to tell the truth in buildings that had never been built for either of them. The board meeting is suspended, Richard said. The sentence moved through the floor like a power cut. At the corridor entrance, two directors exchanged a look they thought was discreet. It was not. Suspended was a word markets heard. Suspended was a word reporters smelled. Suspended was a word that made men like Langford understand that control had left the room. Richard, Langford said at last, his voice lower now, stripped of some of its cultivated warmth. You are making a strategic mistake in public. Richard turned to him with a calm that felt almost cold even to himself. No, I was about to make one in private. Daniel glanced down at another incoming message and stepped closer. Compliance has isolated the deleted thread, he said. There is more. Richard did not look away from Langford. Read it. Daniel's eyes moved across the screen. Bell asks whether legal will notice the swap before execution. Langford replies, not if Richard is first through the door and the room is already seated. The air in the lobby changed again. No gasps this time. Just a stillness so complete it seemed to hum in the recessed lighting. I am basing this on evidence your own messages created. But she is the reason I looked. That ended it. Security guided Bell away first. Langford followed a second later, but not before his eyes passed once more over Naomi with a kind of cool disbelief, as if he still could not understand how the morning had unraveled through her. Richard watched them go until the corridor swallowed both men. Only then did the executive floor seem to exhale. The board members began drifting back, subdued now, their voices low, their authority dimmed by exposure. Evelyn dismissed the outer staff from the lobby in clipped, efficient tones. Daniel remained by the counter, already building the legal spine of what came next. Yet Richard barely heard any of it. His attention had returned to Naomi, who was suddenly very small again now that the danger had passed, just a little girl in an old cardigan with tired eyes and an untied lace. She looked up at him, uncertain for the first time all morning. Is my mom in trouble? She asked. The question hit harder than scandal, harder than betrayal, harder than the board. Angela's face crumpled for half a second before she caught it. Richard looked at the woman, at the cart, at the glove, at the child who had saved him, and then asked only that. And in the bright, cold quiet of his own building, shame finally reached all the way through him. Richard Whitmore had answered harder questions in Senate hearings, earnings calls, and closed-door negotiations worth more money than most people saw in 10 lifetimes. But the one that stopped him came from a 9-year-old girl standing beside a cleaning cart with a bent notebook in her hands. Is my mom in trouble? Naomi Carter asked it without accusation. That was what made it worse. She was not bargaining. She was not trying to turn courage into reward. She only wanted to know whether telling the truth had just cost her mother the job that kept food in their apartment and lights on at night. Richard felt the weight of the lobby shift in a direction no board training had ever prepared him for. The marble floors, the frosted glass, the tailored silence of his executive floor all suddenly seemed built for the wrong kind of strength. Angela Carter lowered her eyes at once, as if she had already learned not to hope too quickly in places like this. One hand still rested lightly on Naomi's shoulder. The other hung by her side, the loose gray glove folded in on itself like something unfinished. Richard looked at the glove, then at Naomi's untied shoelace, then at the reception counter where the altered packet still lay beneath the lights like evidence from another species of world. No, he said at last. His voice came out quieter than before, but steadier too. Your mother is not in trouble. Naomi studied his face as though checking whether adults meant what they said. Angela did not speak. She pressed her lips together the way people do when relief arrives, too close to fear to trust yet. Richard turned toward the cluster of staff still lingering near the corridor. "Let it be clear," he said, not loudly, but in a tone that carried cleanly across stone and glass. "Angela Carter will not be penalized for bringing her daughter into this building today, and neither of them will face retaliation of any kind for what happened here." Evelyn Price looked up from her device at once, understanding the sentence for what it was. Not reassurance. Record. Something that could be cited later if needed. She nodded once and typed quickly, formalizing it in writing before doubt could crawl back into the room. Daniel Reeves closed the leather portfolio over the altered packet and moved closer. "I will notify Human Resources and Compliance immediately," he said. Richard nodded. "Do that." Then, after a beat, "and put it in language no one can pretend to misunderstand." Daniel gave the smallest hint of agreement. He understood. Bureaucracies had 1,000 elegant ways to punish the inconvenient while denying they were doing it. Richard had built too many of those systems not to know. Naomi let out a breath she had clearly been holding for several minutes. Her shoulders dropped by less than an inch. It made her look younger all at once. The steadiness was still there, but now he could see the child inside it again. The fourth grader who should have been worrying about spelling tests and lunch trays instead of indemnity clauses and board conspiracies. Angela finally found her voice. "Thank you, sir," she said, and the words were respectful, but there was something in them that pained Richard more than anger. Would have. Gratitude for not being punished after saving the company. Gratitude as survival. He had heard that tone before and never hated it more than he did now. "You do not need to thank me for that," he said. Angela looked up then, just briefly, and in that glance he saw that she understood exactly what he meant. Around them the lobby was thinning. Board members had retreated in small, tense clusters. Assistants were moving with quieter feet. Somewhere down the executive hall a phone rang once and stopped. The morning had not resumed. It had simply become something else. Richard crouched then, not out of performance, not to soften an image for the staff still watching, but because he suddenly could not bear speaking to Naomi from full height any longer. The marble floor cooled through the fabric at his knee. Up close, he could see the pencil smudge along the side of her hand more clearly, the rough edge of the notebook cover, the tiny fray in the cuff of her cardigan. Signs of an ordinary child. Signs the building had almost trained everyone to overlook. "Naomi," he said, and when he used her name the space between them changed. "You did something very brave today." She blinked. "I was scared." Richard gave a small nod. That is usually how bravery works. For the first time that morning, a faint expression touched her face, not quite a smile, but the beginning of one. "My daddy used to say that too," she said. The sentence reached Richard in a place he had not let anyone touch in years. Margaret's voice rose in memory again, softer than the air vents, clearer than the city 32 floors below. "Character is what you do before the room decides you matter." He had not thought of that line in a long time. Or perhaps he had avoided it. Angela glanced at the wall clock near reception and then quickly away, the reflex of someone whose time always belonged partly to someone else's schedule. Richard noticed. "What time does Naomi need to be picked up from school normally?" he asked. Angela seemed surprised by the question. "Usually 3:15, sir. Today they closed early for a water main issue. I did not have anybody to call." Naomi looked down at her sneakers. "I was supposed to stay in the break room." "Instead," Richard said gently, "you saved me from walking into a trap." Naomi's fingers traced the bent corner of the notebook. "I just did what my daddy taught me. If something feels wrong, slow down and look again." Richard stood, but the words stayed with him. Slow down and look again. Such a simple instruction. Yet in a building full of experts, only one child had obeyed it. Evelyn approached and lowered her voice. "Sir, Conference Room C is secured. Compliance wants your authorization to seize both workstations and suspend their remote access permanently." Richard took his eyes off Naomi with effort. "Authorized." Evelyn nodded and stepped away. Daniel remained beside the counter, waiting. There was more, Richard could tell. "What is it?" Daniel glanced toward Naomi and Angela before answering. "There is an issue with how this started," he said quietly. "If Langford and Bell timed your entrance, they may also have manipulated agenda order and proxy commitments. This could go beyond one vote." Richard looked at the sealed portfolio, then at the long glass corridor leading to the boardroom, and understood that the trap had likely been larger than a single signature. Naomi had not just stopped a bad document. She may have interrupted the first step in something designed to take much more. When he looked back down at her, she was watching his face again, careful, observant, almost as if she knew another truth had just entered the room before anyone said it out loud. Richard Whitmore had learned, over the years, that the most dangerous conspiracies were never satisfied with a single outcome. If Langford and Bell had only wanted one altered page, they would not have timed his entrance so carefully, coordinated message threads, and risked using executive access points minutes before a board vote. The trap had always been larger than paper. He saw that clearly now, standing under the cold white lights of his own lobby with Naomi Carter looking up at him, as if she could already tell the morning was not finished. Daniel Reeves kept his voice low, but not so low that the gravity of it softened. If they controlled the order of signatures, they may also have controlled how the proxy votes were queued in the board system. If that is true, then this was not just about liability. It may have been about governance control after the vote. Richard felt the words land with a different kind of weight. Liability was damage. Governance control was takeover. Quiet. Internal. Bloodless in the way the worst corporate moves often were. He turned toward the board corridor. The frosted glass doors at the end of the hall looked the same as they had 40 minutes earlier, polished and expensive and meant to inspire confidence. Now they looked like the entrance to a stage where the wrong people had nearly rewritten the ending. Lock the board portal, Richard said. Daniel nodded at once. Already in progress. Freeze all proxy actions scheduled for this morning. Done. And pull the final agenda revisions from midnight forward. Daniel's expression sharpened. You think they changed sequencing too? Richard looked at the sealed portfolio on the counter, then at Naomi's notebook, then back to Daniel. I think men who gamble this much do not stop at one trick. Naomi absorbed that quietly. Richard could see her mind working again, not with the strain of confusion, but with the patient sorting of a child who had been taught that truth had shape if you stayed with it long enough. Angela stood beside her, exhausted now in a way that had nothing to do with cleaning shifts or school pickups. Crisis had entered her body and stayed there. Yet she did not rush Naomi away. She did not tell her daughter to stop looking, stop listening, stop helping. Richard noticed that too. In another family, in another building, fear might have silenced the child by now. Angela had not done that. She had stayed close and let Naomi remain herself. That took its own kind of courage. Evelyn returned from the corridor with a slim tablet in one hand and a paper folder in the other. Sir, conference room C is secured. Compliance wants to know whether outside counsel should be notified now or after internal review. Richard did not hesitate. Now. Evelyn nodded. There is something else. She opened the paper folder and handed him a printed sheet. Facilities sent the board agenda history. There were 2 revisions after 8:30 this morning. Richard scanned the page. Timestamps. User credentials. Change summaries. One revision moved the indemnity review lower in the sequence, pushing it beneath market outlook and personnel approvals. Another shortened open discussion and flagged the legal packet as pre-cleared to save time. Save time. Richard almost smiled at the cruelty of the phrase. That was the point, was not it? Hurry the room. Flatten the scrutiny. Make signature feel like momentum instead of consent. Naomi looked up at him. They wanted everybody tired of waiting, she said softly. Richard lowered the page and stared at her for a second. Yes, he said. That is exactly what they wanted. Daniel took the agenda sheet from him and looked over it quickly. The revision came from Langford's board credentials, he said. Bell revised the packet. Langford revised the sequence. Together they built the lane. The sentence settled into the lobby with almost architectural certainty. Not panic. Not scandal in the dramatic sense. Design. This had been designed. Naomi shifted her notebook from one arm to the other. That is why he said the room would follow if you went first, she said. Because by then everybody would already feel late. Richard felt something close in his chest. He had spent decades mastering rooms like that, reading tempo, controlling tempo, using delay and urgency as tools. And this morning, 2 men from his own inner circle had aimed the same mechanics back at him, assuming he would become the very thing his wife had once warned him against. A man too practiced at authority to check the bottom of the page. a man too used to being followed to realize the room had been arranged before he entered it. Margaret would have hated the elegance of that. She had always distrusted elegant wrongdoing more than obvious corruption. It made decent people feel clever for overlooking it. Richard looked at Naomi again. Her cardigan sleeve had slipped back just enough to show the tiny elastic bracelet on her wrist, the kind children traded in school colors or won from coin machines. There was something devastating about that detail in this place. She belonged to a world of pencil boxes and lunch lines and library corners. Yet she had walked into a corporate ambush and seen the moral center of it faster than the adults. "Sir," Daniel said, drawing Richard back. "If the board sequence was manipulated, then the vote itself may be compromised whether it happened or not. We need a formal statement before word leaks." Richard nodded once. "Draft it, then, after a beat, and name the reason plainly. I do not want language that protects reputations more than facts." Daniel almost smiled, but it never quite formed. "Understood." Down the hall, beyond the frosted doors, muffled voices rose and fell as the waiting board members learned that the morning had changed permanently. Somewhere an elevator chimed. Somewhere a phone vibrated against a hard surface. The building was still moving, still breathing, still pretending to be a normal workday. But the center of it had shifted to this lobby and to the child standing beside a cleaning cart with graphite on her hand. Naomi looked up at Richard once more. "Did they want to take your company?" she asked. The question was simple in the way children's questions often are. So simple they cut past performance and hit the bone beneath it. Richard considered lying gently. He considered giving her something softer. But she had earned better than softness disguised as respect. "Yes," he said. "Maybe not all at once, but piece by piece." Quietly, Naomi nodded as if that matched something she already knew about how wrong people worked. Angela tightened her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Richard looked at both of them and understood, with a clarity that left no room for vanity, that this story was no longer only about stopping a bad vote. It was about what kind of man he would be after being saved by people his world had trained itself not to see. Then Evelyn's tablet lit again, and when she checked the screen, her expression changed. "Sir," she said carefully, "outside counsel is asking one question before they proceed. They want to know who first identified the packet alteration." For the briefest second, the lobby went quiet all over again. Richard turned toward Naomi. So did Daniel. So did Angela. And in that silence, everyone understood that the answer mattered for far more than credit. Richard Whitmore had answered the question in his own mind before anyone else finished looking at him. Who first identified the packet alteration? The answer was standing 3 feet away in an old-school cardigan with one shoelace still loose and a bent notebook pressed to her chest. Yet the fact that outside counsel had asked the question at all told him something ugly about the world he had helped build. In companies like his, truth was never allowed to enter the record without first being measured against status. Who said it? What title? What floor? Badge? What kind of voice? Naomi Carter had spoken first, seen first, remembered first, and still there was a pause because she was 9 years old, because she was black, because her mother cleaned the glass offices on the executive floor instead of sitting in them. Richard felt the full shame of that settle into him with a weight no headline ever could. Evelyn stood with the glowing tablet angled toward him, waiting. Daniel Reeves waited too, though his expression had already changed. He understood the legal stakes. Witnesses became narratives. Narratives became records. Records became history. Richard looked at Naomi, then at Angela beside her, and something in him refused the usual polished path. "Tell them the first person who identified the alteration was Naomi Carter," he said. Evelyn did not move for half a beat. The answer had been so direct it almost startled the room. Then she nodded and typed it exactly as spoken. Daniel's eyes lifted, and in them Richard saw not surprise, but recognition. The choice mattered, not just morally, structurally. If the truth entered cleanly now, no one could sand down its edges later and turn a child's courage into anonymous staff awareness or vague internal review. Angela inhaled sharply beside Naomi. She looked as though she wanted to interrupt, to protect, to ask whether putting her daughter's name into something this large would expose her to a world that had already shown how easily it dismissed and used people like them. Richard understood the fear. He turned toward her before she had to speak it. "Her name will be protected where it needs to be," he said quietly. but it will not be erased. Angela held his gaze for a long second, and something passed between them then that had nothing to do with wealth or position. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. It was closer to recognition. The kind that begins when one person realizes another has finally understood the price of being unseen. Naomi looked up from her notebook. "Why does it matter who said it first?" she asked. It was the kind of question that made adult systems sound foolish the moment they had to explain themselves honestly. Richard crouched again so he could answer her at eye level. The marble pressed cool through his trouser leg. "Because sometimes people try to keep the truth and throw away the person who carried it," he said. Naomi frowned slightly, thinking it through. That is not fair. The simplicity of it almost broke him. Around them, the executive floor kept breathing in quiet corporate motions. Assistants moved softly. A phone rang and stopped. The city glimmered through the high windows beyond the lobby glass, silver and distant, and full of people walking with coffee cups and deadlines. Unaware that on the 32nd floor of Whitmore Capital, a little girl had just said the most adult thing in the building. "That is not fair." Richard gave the smallest nod. "No," he said. "It is not." Daniel's phone buzzed with an incoming response from outside counsel. He read it quickly and looked up. "They want a formal witness summary as soon as possible," he said. Angela's body tightened at once. Naomi felt it and leaned just slightly into her mother's side. Richard stood. "Then it happens on our terms," he said. He looked at Angela directly. "No pressure. No intimidation. No one speaks to Naomi without you present. Legal will take the statement in a private room, and if you want an advocate there, I will arrange it." Angela blinked as if the offer itself was unfamiliar terrain. "An advocate? Someone there for you," Richard said. "Not for the company." The silence after that was different from the others that morning. Softer. Less sharp. Angela's eyes shone, and this time she did not look away quickly enough to hide it. "Nobody usually offers that," she said. Richard believed her instantly, and that belief sat inside him like a judgment. Of course nobody usually offered that. People like Angela Carter were expected to be grateful for being allowed into process at all. Naomi, however, was looking past him again, not to danger this time, but to the sealed leather portfolio still resting on the reception counter. "Are they going to say I was lying?" she asked. Daniel answered before Richard could. "They may try to say you misunderstood," he said carefully. "But that is not the same thing." Naomi thought about that. It kind of as if grown-ups believe them. Daniel had no answer ready for that. Neither did Richard. Because she was right. That was exactly how power often worked. It translated insult into procedure and doubt into distance until the truth sounded childish beside a better suit. Richard stepped to the counter, took Naomi's bent notebook gently from her hands only after she nodded, and looked at the careful pencil print again. Legal walks him in. Version B, board follows signature. Blame shifts after approval. The letters were uneven in places. The way children's writing often is when they are listening faster than they can record, but the meaning had held. So had she. He handed the notebook back with more care than he would have shown most contracts. "They will not be able to erase what you saw," he said. Naomi took the notebook and held it close again. "My daddy used to say paper is how people remember when they want to forget on purpose." Richard stared at her. Another sentence from a dead father who had left his daughter not money or status, but the habits of truth. Angela let out a small breath that sounded half like grief and half like pride. "He said things like that all the time," she murmured. "Drove everybody a little crazy with it." Richard almost smiled. Almost. He could imagine the man already. Not because he knew him, but because he knew what kind of person taught a child to notice margins, timing, and the bottom of the page. The kind of person who believed decency required skill, not just feeling. Evelyn looked up from her tablet again. "Sir, outside counsel also wants to know whether you intend to proceed with a reconstituted board session today or postpone, pending full review." Richard glanced toward the frosted doors at the end of the corridor. Behind them sat men and women who had entered the morning expecting control and found themselves waiting on the truth spoken by a child they might not have greeted in an elevator. He looked back at Naomi, at Angela, at the cleaning cart still standing in the edge of the white light. "Postpone it," he said. Then, after a beat, "and add this to the record. Whitmore Capital delayed its own board action because a child told the truth and the company chose, finally, to listen." No one in the lobby spoke after that. Even Evelyn paused before typing, as though the sentence had reached some place in the room the others had not. Naomi looked up at him with wide, searching eyes, and for the first time all morning, the beginning of a real smile touched her mouth. It was small and tired and uncertain, but it was there. And in that bright, overlit lobby, it felt more honest than everything else money had built around it. By early afternoon, the executive floor had quieted into the kind of silence that only follows exposure. Not peace, not relief, just the hush that settles over a building after too many polished lies have been named out loud. The boardroom remained closed. Conference room C remained occupied. Compliance and outside counsel moved through the corridors in measured suits and low voices, carrying folders where confidence had been only hours earlier. But none of that was what stayed with Richard Whitmore as he stepped out of his office and looked down the West Hall. What stayed with him was smaller. At the far end of the lobby, near the service corridor where the light always ran colder against the floor, Angela Carter was standing beside her cleaning cart again. Not because anyone had asked her to resume. Not because the day had become normal. But because some people, after the world shakes under them, still return to the thing that keeps life moving. Naomi sat on a chair near reception with a cup of apple juice and a small paper bag of crackers Evelyn had found downstairs. Her backpack rested at her feet. Her notebook lay open in her lap, but she was no longer writing. She was drawing something instead, her pencil moving in small, careful strokes, her face finally looking like it belonged to a child who had used up more courage in one morning than most adults did in a year. Richard stood there for a moment before walking toward them. His shoes made almost no sound on the polished stone, but Naomi looked up anyway. She had that kind of awareness. When she saw him, she straightened slightly, not out of fear now, but habit. Angela did the same and started to set aside the cloth in her hand. "Do not," Richard said gently. "Please." She stopped. The word please hung there between them with a quiet weight of its own. He was not sure whether Angela noticed it as much as he did, but Naomi did. He could tell by the way her eyes moved from his face to her mother's and back. Richard crouched beside Naomi's chair. In his hand was the small cardboard box Evelyn had found under the reception desk an hour earlier, where Naomi must have set it down during the morning's chaos and forgotten it. It held 6 sharpened colored pencils, 2 erasers, and a ruler with cartoon stars faded nearly white from use. He held it out to her. "You left this behind." Naomi took the box carefully, like it mattered. That, too, stayed with him. In rooms where men had spent the day trying to steal control of a company, the object that felt most honest was a little cardboard pencil box returned to a child. "Thank you," she said. Richard nodded, then glanced at the drawing in her lap. It was simple, done in school pencil on lined paper. A hallway, tall doors at the end, a little girl standing in front of them with her arms out. Behind her, a woman beside a cart. In front of her, a man in a suit who had stopped walking. The proportions were not exact. The perspective tilted. But the truth in it was unmistakable. Naomi noticed him looking. "I made the floor too shiny," she said quietly. Richard almost smiled. "No," he said. "You got that part right." Angela let out the smallest breath that might have been a laugh if the day had not been so long. It softened something in the air. Richard stood and turned to her. "Ms. Carter," he said, and the formality of it made her blink. "Human Resources has been informed in writing that neither you nor Naomi will face retaliation. Legal has documented her witness statement with counsel present. And beginning next week, your employment status is being converted from contract to full staff with benefits." Angela stared at him as if she had not heard correctly. Her hand tightened around the cloth. "Sir, but the words did not come. Richard shook his head lightly. "That is not charity," he said. "It is correction." Angela lowered her eyes then, not in submission this time, but because emotion had finally reached a place she could not hide. Naomi looked from her mother to Richard with a seriousness that was almost painful. "Does that mean my mom can stay?" she asked. Richard looked at her fully. "Yes," he said, "if she wants to." Angela closed her eyes for 1 second and let them open again slowly. "I want to," she whispered. The bright white light above the lobby caught the wetness in her eyes, but she did not wipe it away. She did not have to. No one in that moment would have mistaken it for weakness. Richard glanced once toward the frosted doors of the board corridor. Beyond them, lawyers were still working, reports were still being drafted, and men who had mistaken polish for immunity were beginning to learn the cost of being seen clearly. But that was no longer the center of the day. The center stood here, beside a cleaning cart, in a cardigan with frayed cuffs and a pencil box in her hands. Naomi looked down at her drawing again. "My daddy used to say people remember the big room," she said softly. "But God remembers who told the truth in it." The sentence passed through Richard like light through cold glass. For a moment he could not answer. He thought of Margaret then, not as she had looked in photographs or gala rooms, but in that old kitchen years ago, rain at the window, tea cooling in her hand, warning him that decency was the one thing money could not simulate for long. He had not understood her fully then. He did now. "Your father was a wise man," he said. Naomi nodded once. "My mom says that too." Angela smiled through her tears then, small and quiet and tired, and it changed the whole lobby more than any board vote could have. Richard looked at both of them and felt, beneath the wreckage of the morning, something steadier beginning. Not absolution. He had not earned that. Not redemption finished. But the first honest step toward it. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his own pen, heavy, silver, engraved near the clip. The kind of pen men used to sign things that altered lives. He held it out to Naomi. "For your notebook," he said. Naomi stared at it, then at him. "This looks expensive." "It is," Richard said. "Then I will only use it for important things." He swallowed something that felt too close to regret and nodded. "That would be appropriate." Naomi took the pen with both hands. Very carefully, like truth itself. The lobby fell quiet again after that, but now it was a different kind of quiet. Softer. Human. The late afternoon light had shifted through the high windows and turned. Warmer against the glass, laying pale gold over the marble where the morning had been all steel and frost. Angela stood beside her cart with her shoulders no longer bent under apology. Naomi sat with her pencil box, her new pen, and her drawing of the moment a powerful man was forced to stop and listen. And Richard Whitmore, who had nearly walked into a room built to betray him, stood in the middle of his own building and understood at last that the person who had saved him was never the loudest, the richest, or the most respected in the room. She was the child everyone had first tried to move aside. He looked once more at Naomi, then at the long polished floor stretching toward the closed boardroom doors, and when he spoke, his voice was low enough that only they heard it. "You were the bravest person in this building today." Naomi looked up, surprised, then smiled for real this time, small and warm and certain. And in the fading light of the executive floor, with the city burning quietly beyond the glass and the smell of fresh cleaners still in the air, Richard realized something he would carry longer than scandal or strategy or corporate survival. They mocked the wrong person only because they mistook gentleness for weakness. But in the end, it was a little girl with truth in her hands who taught them what strength actually looked like.